say he's a technical wizard. Some say he was born in Cornwall, while some say he's on a journey. It's The Journey, and here's your host, David Hackett.
Riddled with chronic low back pain and digestive disorders since childhood, our guest today spent 50 years exploring the world, uncovering secrets to health and happiness. Intent on promoting optimal wellness, she features some of her favorite easy, enjoyable, accessible, and effective tools in her book. And today, we are going to join Deborah to the journey, because I'm not going to read all her bio she sent me. It's her journey, not my journey. Hi, Deborah.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. And my journey is long because I'm already 65 years old. But at the same time, I look at life as an ongoing journey. And I love journeys. I consider myself, a senior citizen backpacker of the world. And I have been that way most of my life. I actually first started traveling alone beyond my country's borders when I was just 16 years old.
That is amazing.
So
I was going to say, everyone has a journey, as I briefly touched upon, and you touched upon. You started at a young age, and obviously, our journeys in life can be difficult because it's never smooth, it's never easy, it's never straightforward. But what was your earliest memory that inspired you to start your journey?
Well, unfortunately, I still see that I still need more and more inspiration because I feel that it is, again, it's an ongoing process. But I actually feel very blessed, extremely lucky, because from the time I was maybe 12 years old, I did have several issues. I had chronic back pain when I would stand and sit. Every time I would get up and get down, I had very bad pains. And then I have also had my entire life, I've had digestive disorders, and I was diagnosed very young with both. So fortunately, my mother did take me to good specialists and they got all the diagnoses. And I'm very thankful for that, because as a result of those diagnoses, and fortunately, probably because of my young age, I was never suggested, that I was never given any kind of meds for my issues. I was very fortunate in that those medical practitioners, the specialists, gave me ways to cope with what I was dealing with. So from the chronic back pain, my diagnosis was that it was musculoskeletal. And in the book that I've written, From the Boxing Ring to the Ashram, one entire chapter is based on one of my mentors who is a doctor, a physician who specializes in back pain and back structure. And one of the things he says is, you cannot do anything without a diagnosis. And I'm a certified yoga therapist, and I recognize that because I so many times will have clients that will say to me, oh, I have sciatica, or, oh, I have whatever. And I will say, has it been diagnosed? No. And until you have that diagnosis, you do not know how to treat it. So again, I had my diagnosis for my back pain when I was very young. And my orthopedic surgeon, he told me that I needed to do physical exercises to help straighten and strengthen my back. And that is something that I continue to do every single day of my life. And I can't just forget about it and go for a couple months without it, because then, of course, I will feel the pain again. And as far as my digestive disorders, again, I was diagnosed. And not only was I diagnosed, but my gastroenterologist suggested that I keep a food diary. And that is actually something that I suggest a lot with my clients. I do a lot of specialization as a yoga therapist I work a lot in bone health, but I also work with diabetics and I work with digestive disorders because they are related. Actually, all three of those are related. And to me, it is so important to do that food diary, because if we're eating the same food from the time we're born, and if we have stomach issues from the time we're born, we don't recognize what can be the trigger for us.
I understand that totally. And it's like I suffer from eczema and I know I can't touch certain foods. Now it's difficult because most of those foods is everyday foods that most people generally can eat. But when I was growing up, it was more difficult because I was told I couldn't have tomatoes, I couldn't eat pork products, I couldn't eat eggs, I couldn't have dairy, and those are the very commodities that most people have. Like milk, I had to have goat's milk compared to normal milk. So I do.
However, that is so common. I have actually done work with the Food Allergy and Anaphylaxis Network. And there are 6 main food products or categories that are high allergens. Of course, everyone is different, and tomatoes, for example, are not at the top of the list, but dairy is definitely at the top of the list. And I believe that cow's milk in particular is one of those food items that in many parts of the world, we have it from the time we're little itty bitty children. And so, like with me, if I had stomach issues from the time I was a child, it was just normal for me.
Yeah. And, you say it's normal, and I agree it's normal. And even now I do drink dairy stuff. I'm okay with it, but I still prefer the alternative, like goat's milk. I like soy milk. I like oat milk because that's what I was used to when I was younger. So I still like that taste. So that's my normal. I like the alternative, and I believe in the alternative.
I do too. I personally am vegan, and one of the chapters in my book talks a little bit about why I'm a vegan, but it talks more from one of my mentors, him talking about why plant-based diets are healthier. And it's not necessarily, I'm not saying, oh, you have to eliminate everything. But again, I recognize there is a huge difference in how we digest cow's milk versus goat's milk. Another thing that is much easier to digest than milk is yogurt. And if you look at people around the world, have been studies that indicate what people around the world which populations are lactose intolerant. And I was raised in a big dairy part of the United States. And the way that the people in my community ate dairy is not normal compared to other parts of the world and I've lived in South America and I've worked in other parts of the world as well. And in many other countries, dairy is consumed in moderation. And again, oftentimes it's goat or even sheep milk in terms of with the cheeses, such as feta. Let's just say feta. And again, the yogurt is much easier to digest. And again, one of the principles in my book, and this is also a principle that I do with my clients when I am coaching for dietary changes for digestive disorders or for diabetes, blood sugar management, is we have to try we can't just go a day without dairy and see how it goes, for example. We have to do it for a much longer period of time because the body it takes a while for the body to rid itself of those substances. And to change your habits, you were talking about how you prefer different alternatives to cow milk now. And to change any habit takes 40 days. And that's why in my book, I actually have a 40-day tracker that's free and downloadable that you can track all of the different habits that I'm encouraging people to adopt in my book. And just one of those habits, for example, can be dietary. Other habits are completely different. It can be things such as laugh every single day, or write down what you are grateful for every single day. But again, any habit, you need to practice it for 40 days for it to be ingrained.
Yeah, I totally understand. So we talked about before we started recording, you got an excerpt from your book, I believe. If you want to share that with us, and then we can go into the next topic afterwards.
Sure. Well, my book is called From the Boxing Ring to the Ashram, and it's basically life lessons from a dozen of my gurus or mentors on 4 continents. And one of the chapters features a husband and wife musical duo. And the content of that chapter is all about how and why singing is good for your body, your mind, and your soul. And the excerpt that I'm going to read to you is about me as a child and some of my favorite memories in terms of, what made me feel so wonderful as a child. Sunday mornings, while everyone else at my house was still asleep, I would head down to the family room. Perched on top of a red and white checkered tablecloth was our only television. It was a black and white set with rabbit ear antennae and a dial to select between the only 5 channels with programming. It's obvious that I'm old. During church time, the Queen of Gospel, Mahalia Jackson, sang a few feet away from me through the bulky console. Her voice and inner fire were captivating. The power and devotion in her songs of praise were nothing like the squawking band or dishwatery chorus classes at my predominantly white elementary school. Even better than listening to Mahalia on the tube was singing with my older sister in our living room to an invisible audience with a make-believe stage on our green, low-pile carpeted floors. We harmonized to The Sound of Music and Mary Poppins. At those moments, I was in heaven. And I also want to add that 2 of my favorite childhood moments, again, things have changed so much, but we took the train, the elevated train, like a metro or a subway, half an hour from where we lived to downtown Chicago on these 2 occasions. And we went to a huge theater, gorgeous, majestic. And that's where movies used to be. And that's where I saw The Sound of Music and Mary Poppins. And those were experiences. And I was just overwhelmed with the positive energy and feeling. And I'm sorry, but when you go to Netflix and plug it in, it's just not the same.
Yeah, I understand that so much. And even though people nowadays, and I'm not saying I'm one of them, I used to be, but I'm not anymore. But you have everything plugged in to make it sound like a cinema or a theatre performance. It's still not the same pizzazz where you can feel like you're actually there. I always find that going to a performance in real life is better than watching it.
Well, the other thing is this was a major special event for us to take the train and go to downtown. And, we probably got dressed up to go to the movies. Whereas now people, again, they're in their pajamas or who knows what when they're they're streaming their movies.
And you said about the time when it was five TV channels. I remember in England there was originally four channels when I was growing up. And then in the late 90s, it became five channels. And then in the early 2000s, it became like 40 channels. Now, if you wanted extra, like over 100 channels at the time, you had to pay money for it. But for people who was on low income, they only had four or five channels until the luxury of the channels that were free came out. But even then, it was very basic. It was not as glamorous, and people were like, "We've seen this before," but it was something different.
Well, we actually had four. I know England is very different in terms of commercials. We had four commercial channels, and then we had the one public broadcasting system, which is non-commercial and more educational.
Yeah, so we had trying to remember, and I don't mind advertising them because we're not advertising, but there was the main public one, which was the BBC, which covered BBC One and BBC Two. Now on the radio it's slightly different, but on TV it was BBC One, BBC Two, and then there was ITV, which was the original commercial channel, which was Channel 3, and then in 1982, I think it was 81, I did the interview with the person who was the first voice on that channel, and that was Channel 4. And it was like that for so many years, and then 97 Channel 5 came out. But ITV, Channel 4, and Channel 5 were commercial based. Now, the commercials, as you know, in America can be long. In England, they had to be contained within 3 minutes. So I learned that quite at an early age. You had to have commercials. So they had like 6, 7 commercials in 3 minutes. Now you listen to commercials in America, commercials are, I think, statistically longer, and you got more of them.
Well, I worked in the television industry. I have worked in marketing communications my entire life. I actually started again when I was, maybe 16 years old, working for my school newspaper. So I have, again, worked in that field for a very long time, and I've seen how things have changed. And I did work in television for about 4 years. I loved working in television. And I clearly recall when there was, I don't know what they call it, but we had federal communications. It was FCC, Federal Communications, I don't know what. And they set all these guidelines for the TV stations. And I remember when they lifted some of their rules. So there used to be many more restrictions.
And it just shows that because of the day, how the rules were, you had to make sure that it wasn't misleading. You had to make sure they were following guidelines. Like it couldn't force, I don't know if it was the way it was, but they couldn't force you. Yeah, they were trying to sell it, but they couldn't force you.
I remember one of the restrictions that was lifted, and I felt very sad about this. And I actually worked doing all the public service announcements for my TV station. And I am a huge believer of public service. And one of the chapters in my book is all about selfless service. And so again, I think it is so important. And I remember when our federal governing board for television removed the requirement for a certain amount of public service state mentions. So it used to be that all television stations, and I believe radio, had to have X number of minutes per hour that were dedicated for free community announcements.
Yeah.
Then they changed that requirement. And again, I'm such a believer always, again, since my early days, of supporting our community however we can. And I would like to think that television and radio, newspaper, all media can contribute to our society. And that is actually why I wrote my book, because I left the corporate world. Speaking of journeys, I was always working for the multinationals, selling, all sorts of products and services that I didn't believe in and that I never bought. And, but it was my job, right? And finally, in about 2011, I decided I cannot do this anymore. So I left the job security, all the benefits, and I opened up my own consultancy. And when I opened up my own consultancy, the mission statement that I put on the back of my card was dedicated to positive transformation. So I really wanted to make a positive impact in my community. And I felt that with my background, as opposed to selling toxic things to the community, I wanted to do something to help. And so again, that was back in 2011 when I decided that my consultancy would do good as opposed to harm in our community. And that is also the purpose of my book. I truly believe that with the 12 life lessons that I present from my mentors around the world, that people can be their healthiest and their happiest. And so it's totally being done from the point of selfless service, which again is one of the topics in my book, one of the chapters in my book.
And we're talking about community. I don't know how it is in America, but in England, they started having, the BBC radio stations. They started having the commercial radio stations. And only in the last 10 to 15 years, I believe it is, I could be wrong, but we started having community radio stations. And community radio station I was a part of for 14 years, because I believed the ethos of that, because it was for the community.
Exactly. And in fact, yesterday, I live in a very small town, population 2,300 people. And yesterday I did a 1-hour live radio interview with my community radio station, which it's so impressive that my community even has one. And it's a nonprofit. I knew it was a nonprofit, but they told me yesterday that there are only 2 people on salary or on a payroll. And one of them is the person that does all the technical fixings. If anything goes wrong, and something did go wrong yesterday, and that person immediately was there to fix it. But all the other people working there are volunteers, and it's all about spreading positive news as well. And again, because of my history working forever in this industry, one of the terms that we used to use in the public relations industry is, if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah.
And I know you know what that means, but for anyone that does not know what it means that crime, horrible things that happen, such as disasters, murders, those are top in priority for most media outlets.
Mm.
And that is so unhealthy for our society. And that is why, fortunately, of course, with all the narrow, I don't want to say narrow casting, but with all the vertical options now with podcasts and with YouTube, there are so many more positive outlets out there. But again, back in my day, and it wasn't that long ago, if it bleeds, it leads. Very sad.
But we talk about our community radio stations are volunteer based. That's what most people do forget. Yes, there is one, in my case, that there was one paid person, and I hold that person highly because they got me to where I am now. But the fact is, community radio station, when I first heard of it, it was like, I didn't know it existed. Now, it was online. That's the only thing. There's no major commercials keeping, it's funded by people who started it, and then there is ways of generating money, but it was not a well-heard thing because it was online. Now, I see now that station, and like I said, I've been part of it, and I still hold it close in my heart. I see now it grew to be a online, to a FM on radio station. I saw it evolve from its old name to its new name, but it's still obviously branded as the old name for, business purposes. But it just grew from something small, even though it's in one part of the community, to a bigger part of the community, which is still that area. But now it's worldwide because they got an app, they got a website, they got a presence. You type in the name and you'll find it, even though people get confused because the name they chose for it now for a radio station, people think it's in Australia, New Zealand, but it's out there. It's recognized. Even though it's still a small percentage of a community, it's still part of a community because it's reaching better, and as it said for the strapline in the beginning, better than ever on FM or wherever it was. It is better than ever because it's reaching more potential.
And of course, you totally understand this, but back in the day when we only had 4 TV stations, everything had to be directed to the masses and to what they felt was what everybody wanted. And so the beauty nowadays with so many outlets is that we can truly find what resonates for us. And I have not looked at numbers lately, but I would have to think that those mainstream biggies are no longer all that big because people are wanting media that is appropriate for them as opposed to the masses.
And that's where the situation then goes into Super Bowl. They get the multi-million-dollar every season at halftime because they mass produce for the millions. Now, it'll hit one person, might not hit another, but they try and mass produce that in the space of however long the halftime break is. I don't know how long it is. I don't follow football much over in America, so I can't really justify it, but I know it's like they advertise Pepsi Cola, they advertise Coca-Cola, they advertise T-Mobile, they advertise Verizon. They're trying to get your attention. But again, they don't use community options. They use the broader scope for things.
So again, I worked in not only marketing in terms of communications and public relations, but I always worked within the world of advertising. And I am very familiar with how the Super Bowl advertising works and the amount that people have to pay for a 30-second commercial is astronomical. That said, there have been, from a creative standpoint, we used to always at my agency watch the Super Bowl. We would have just have a Super Bowl highlights reel, and we would watch just those commercials to see the best of the creative side of advertising.
Mm.
But in terms of some success stories, there have been a number of small startup businesses in the United States that took all of their budget and spent it all on just one Super Bowl ad. And it transformed their business. So a major risk, but it worked.
Yeah. So going into the present now, because we talked a lot about the past, talking about the present, we established you're an author, which we talk about your book, and we've read a bit from it. I assume that's in Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all bookstores. But
Correct.
But how is the present for you in this current climate? Because we've always got to remember we had COVID in the world, which affected many people. But how has the present been for you in the way it's been adapting?
Well, first I want to go back. I know you want to talk about the present, but just going back just 3 years to COVID is I was always, even when I was self-employed, I was still working 7 days a week because I have had multiple different jobs that I juggle. I've also been a writer since 2009, so I have all these different things that I've been juggling. So all of a sudden, the middle of March 2020, I went from working 7 days a week to nothing. And I decided, this is something that I mentioned in my book as well. One of the chapters in my book talks about this. My Ayurvedic doctor, and for those who don't know, Ayurveda is the life science of India. And I consider my Ayurvedic doctor my primary doctor, but I do go for traditional Western labs, and, I get all my checkups from traditional medicine. But my Ayurvedic doctor had recommended that I take 1 day out per week to disconnect from all digital devices and to not drive a car. So basically to do a secular Shabbat or Sabbath, which again that's the entire focus of one chapter in my book. And I always thought, how on earth am I going to be able to disconnect for a day? I can't not get in my car for a day. I live in the middle of nowhere. We have no public transportation. So COVID came. And for me, it was a blessing. I began my 1 day a week digital disconnect and my secular Sabbath. And my Ayurvedic doctor also recommended that periodically I do a 3-day extended Sabbath. And I did that again, March 2022, might have been the end of March 2022. And when I did that, all the ideas from my book popped into my head. I even wrote the outline for my book. I even wrote my marketing plan. It was incredible how once I stopped, working like crazy, even though I was self-employed and I could do it at my own time, all these ideas came into my head. So again, now that was 2020. So in terms of moving forward, I like to think that once you have a book out, again, I'm a marketing person, so the way that I look at it is, once you have a book out, you never stop marketing the book. You have to, it's going to be continuous for the rest of my life. And what I would really like to do is write more books Because the hardest part with anything, just like learning to ride a bike, right? It might be hard at first, but once you get the hang of it, you're on a roll and you're energized and you enjoy it. And so for the future, I would like to see more books that I write.
So we touch upon the future there about more books, but obviously more books needs more inspiration. So what inspiration would you give to people to help them in that future?
That's a great question. And I know for me, and I would recommend it to other people too, is to do a retreat, to do a silent solo retreat. And within the meditation and mindfulness world, what's very common is a 10-day Vipassana silent retreat. And people go, from all over the world that go different places for these silent 10-day retreats. And in these 10-day retreats, they are guided, and you are not even allowed to read a book or to write with pen or paper. And the concept, of course, is that it is breakthrough inspirational. When I did my 3-day, I did choose not to read because reading consumes me. I can read forever. So I decided not to do any reading, but I did allow myself one piece of paper and then just one writing utensil. So I limited it. And again, I thought it was so important and so essential for all of these ideas to come into my head. And so that what I like to tell people is you have to disconnect to get recharged. It's just like a reboot. And we all need reboots. And I quote Annie Lamott, who is an American author. She's an amazing author. And I quote her in my book, and she says something about how, everything needs a reboot, including us, a periodic reboot.
I agree totally.
And in fact, the chapter that talks about the secular Sabbath is called Shabbat as your reboot in the digital age.
Nice.
So unfortunately, we are always stressed. We are always pushed. We are always stretching ourselves to the limit. And things that we think of, going back to when we were talking about food and habits, the habit that most of us have, getting in a car and driving, or getting into the metro or the bus and driving, all of that is really stressful, but it's our norm. And for me, I have always been a very peaceful, low-key person. I've worked in crisis management. I did a lot of work in crisis relations. And I was always, calm and never really, I don't think, I don't think I ever, kind of got too agitated. But our bodies, even though we don't feel it, even though we don't see it, our bodies take all the brunt of that stress.
Yeah.
And that is definitely the root of all of my digestive disorders. And I recognize it. And in fact, even though I've had my digestive disorders my entire life, in the last, I don't know how long it's been now, 15 or more than 15 years, the only time I really had a bad flare-up was the day of my father's funeral. And I was responsible for, doing so much. So of course, the burdens that were on my shoulder, and then of course the grief that I didn't show. I never show grief. My sister calls me Miss Namaste. So I don't show grief. I don't cry. I'm always, calm and cool. But my body grieves.
And I do understand that a lot. Deborah, thank you for sharing your journey with us today. It's been a pleasure. Let's hope the journey carries on being successful for you. Let's hope it will carry on making new possibilities for you in the future.
I love those words. That is very positive and uplifting. I really appreciate that. And the same to you. And thank you so much for providing this space and for allowing people to share their personal journeys.
That was The Journey, hosted by Wise Words Imaging, hosted by David Hackett. Be sure to like, subscribe and listen to another journey coming soon.